give it a quick invocation and get started. Good morning, everybody. I know we have a light crowd here today, but we're going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. I know we have some things we want to hear, and Chairman Lumsden's going to open us up in a quick word of prayer.
Bow with me, please. Almighty, most holy Father, faithful through the ages, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your love and your goodness to us. We thank you for watching over us and caring for us. We thank you for the opportunity that you've given to us to be here today. None of us are here by accidents. We just ask that you would help us to be mindful of you, and as we conduct the business of the state today, that you might help us to understand your will and that we might act on it. For we pray it in Jesus' name, for his sake. Amen.
Thank you, Chairman Lumsden. Just to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork, we do have Mr. Ted Baggett with us today from the Carl Vinson Institute, and he's going to give us a presentation and answer a few questions regarding what has been termed cityhood, and as we've seen over however many years that a number of members of various areas of the state have come together and requested to become new cities, and we've seen that happen. And certainly an involved process and complicated at times. And if you've been on the committee for any length of time, it can be create some tension as well. And so as a new chairman and still kind of learning the process, and not to put anybody backwards, but I thought it might be appropriate for us to take a little bit of a look at it, not to hold anybody back that's already in the process, but see if we're doing everything the best and rightest way, for lack of a better way to say it, and actually, maybe evaluate the process moving forward. But Mr. Baggett, I want to thank you for being here today. And I'm going to turn it over to you. And if you're willing, once you get through the presentation, to take some questions from the committee, we would certainly appreciate that as well.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Good morning. This is just intended to be a high-level overview of some of the key points, and I'm going to try to keep it as succinct as possible so that we can get to your questions if you have any. One of the first things to note is that there's a number of different ways that states approach creating new cities. In Georgia, it's purely a legislative process. We're one of only 7 states that does it that way. In other states, there are a number of different ways of doing that. There are states that allow you to petition to a court, states that allow the petition process to a commission, etc. Ultimately, local governments are creatures of state, and they're afforded state power, but some of the legislatures in our country have devolved that direct responsibility to different entities. Here in Georgia, it's purely legislative. As a matter of historical interest, in the early 20th century in Georgia, superior courts could create cities. They were given that power, and it was often done for small mill towns in Georgia. Bibb City, which used to be in Muskogee County, was an example of one such city. In our state's general statutes prescribe some minimum standards for being incorporated. And the bills that have, as has just been mentioned, that propose to incorporate municipalities have come through this committee in recent years, and the State and Local Government Operations Committee in the Senate. So those minimum standards that are in state law are listed there. I would suggest they're pretty minimal. It's not very hard to meet these, especially in our growing, rapidly suburbanizing and urbanizing state. A minimum of 200 people, minimum population density of 200 people per square mile. 60% of the total number of lots have to be used for purposes that are other than agricultural, essentially. Over 60% of the lots have to be of tracts less than 5 acres or less, and required that all of those criteria are met. A bill proposing to incorporate a municipality can be enacted by the General Assembly. There's no requirement in state law or the Constitution that there be a referendum, though all of the bills that have passed the General Assembly pertinent to cityhood in the last 15 or 20 years have provided that there be a referendum held in the area proposed to be incorporated. As I mentioned, the committees that hear these bills, the committee rules in each committee require that the bill be introduced in the first year of a biennial, considered in the second year, and require that a feasibility study be conducted by either my institution, the Institute of Government, or the Andrew Young School at Georgia State, or the Georgia Tech Enterprise Innovation Institute, and that's in the House rules. There's also a provision, and this was added later, and when I say later, we're really talking about a movement that started with Sandy Springs in about 2005 and comes up to the present day. This, so during, I'd say 2/3 of the way through that movement, so 5 years ago or so, the idea of impact studies on the counties where the cities are to be located was proposed, and that's now found in these rules as well, that both impact studies on the counties or other cities that might be impacted by a new incorporation, studies on that can be introduced or to the committee's consideration. So the feasibility studies themselves, some of the mechanics, typically these groups, these are private groups or activist groups, they have to form some sort of nonprofit in order to be able to enter into a contract with one of these institutions of higher ed. They pay for the study, and we've required at my institution that there be a letter from a state legislator at least supporting the idea that a feasibility study be conducted. Typically that has been either someone from the area or the chairman of one of the two committees where these bills are considered. A couple of detailed points here. We insist, and we make very clear to the groups that are commissioning these studies, that we'll have final say over the methodology. We have to have that in order to do an independent and objective job, and that we're not going to take a position for or against the incorporation of the city. That's a policy decision. We're trying to provide an information tool. The feasibility studies, there are a couple of asterisks here I think that are important to note out. These are tests, these are information tools for likely fiscal feasibility. They're not proposed budgets. And we're looking at what's currently being collected in revenue from the study area for the services that the people commissioning the study want to provide, and trying to figure out if those if there are revenues to meet those needs. So essentially the two questions are, what's the cost for a city of this size and geography to provide the services they've identified, and what are the available revenues in this area that are under consideration for incorporation? When looking at this and when they're selecting services to provide, the Inactive Municipality Statute is a pretty key player here. Those services are listed for you, and that statute is cited. It requires that basically requires that any city to remain in active status, to have its charter and operate, has to provide either directly or indirectly at least 3 of those services on the list. So we've told the groups, it doesn't make sense for you to go forward with a study that doesn't include at least 3 of these, because out of the gate we'd have to tell the legislature that you don't meet the Inactive Municipality Statute. Another detail of the methodology, what we've had to do essentially in most of these studies is look at what the expenditures from peer cities are. Counties are under no obligation to keep their data in a way that shows exactly how much they're spending in every single section of the areas that they serve. And so using peer cities kind of gives you both an idea of what other cities of this size and complexity are spending to provide a particular service, and it gives you an idea of what the level of service might be anticipated to be. You can look at that city, you can appreciate their reputation, you can look at their performance metrics that they keep in-house and figure this is the kind of level we can expect if we're going to expend this amount. And we try to pick those peer cities based on a combination of factors: where they're located, if they're in the urban or rural areas, geographic size, service profiles, demographics. In doing that, we analyze their financial documents, their CAFRs, their budgets. We sit down with their fiscal managers and department heads to make sure we're capturing all the ongoing operational costs, all the capital expenditures, and any of the indirect administrative costs. We then take that and factor it back out to the proposed city based on its size, demographic, and geographic profile. Then for determining revenues, we rely on some of the data from the county tax commissioners, and use a variety of different ways of determining what are the available revenues. Oftentimes there'll be a special tax district. And so if you can look at that and talk to the tax commissioner, if that's being provided for a particular service, we'll simply ask how much revenue was collected for that in the last fiscal year. And then you have an idea of what those available revenues might be for that service. Let's see. It's important to note that there is some revenue that is undesignated or incidental. It simply is collected by whatever local government is in place there. If it's a county and it's in the unincorporated area, those revenues go to the county. If there's a city in place, those revenues go to the city. Those are things like insurance premiums, taxes, occupation taxes. There's then some revenue that's only available to city governments in our state, and that's primarily in the arena of franchise fees. And to put it in shorthand, a franchise fee is effectively rent for use of public right-of-way by a utility. Cities in Georgia can collect electric franchise fees, natural gas franchise fees, and landline telephone fees. County governments cannot. So we look at different ways of trying to estimate what that franchise fee revenue that's unique to cities might be. We also try to identify when there are restrictions on how revenue can be spent. An example for that is hotel-motel tax revenue. Some of those revenues can be put into the general fund of a city. Some must be dedicated to tourism-type activities. So basically, if available revenue meets the likely cost of providing those services, we deem them fiscally feasible. If there's a significant shortfall in revenue necessary to meet expenses, we've deemed them not feasible. And this is, of course, not an endorsement of the ultimate policy decision about whether it should be incorporated. So going back to the role of the General Assembly in this process, as I alluded to earlier, because it's purely a legislative question, it's a political process. And the General Assembly has discretion to determine how it wants to proceed in that process. It can determine the procedural process in terms of which committees to assign, whether to waive or suspend their own committee rules, whether to pass a bill that requires a referendum or not, can choose not to give a hearing to a bill. And, in addition, we saw, this hasn't been the case so much, but in the early days of this movement from 2005 to the present, there were even debates about whether it should be a quote-unquote local bill or a general bill and how that process should be handled. And I think those things really kind of come down to a lot of the internal politics. Some other final notes. The State Office of Congressional and Legislative Reapportionment is a big help. They draw maps based on census blocks. A lot of times city boundaries are drawn on natural geographic features or the intersections of roads. It creates something of a challenge to the process because election officials need to rely on maps that are drawn on census data. The data that's available from the census is kind of critical to use in doing these studies, so that's always a challenge that I just make known to you. There are provisions in the state law that provide for a transition period when the new city launches about when it has to start providing services. And then typically these bills specify both the date of election for the municipal officials and the form of government, what kind of charter the bill is going to have. And then, just sort of a final thought here is that this is our work in the fiscal feasibility arena. That's all it is. It's a best estimate about what the available revenues and costs are. And there's this whole slew of other policy and political considerations that go into the mix here. So that's my overview. I do have one other document that I thought just might be beneficial that Mrs. Eves was kind enough to provide copies of. These are the referenda that have been held since 2005, the outcomes, then the ultimate creation dates if the referenda were successful, and the population of the cities that were created. And I just submit that to you to, inform you of the trend of how that has gone in recent years. But that's essentially an overview, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Baggett. I'm sure we've got a few, and I guess I should have probably prefaced this, but y'all do a wonderful job, and the reason we have asked you to be here is because just about everybody I've talked to on the subject has recommended you as kind of the expert when it comes to these cities and how they evolve. So thank you again for being here. I believe number 17 is the first.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Baggett, do you put any suggestions in your feasibility study about how long the information is good for?
We do not.
Do you have any comments or thoughts around it? Because I've been getting those questions from proponents of cityhood who they themselves want to know how long data is good for. And obviously people who are against cityhood say, well, this data is too old. So do you have any comments or suggestions?
And I hear those questions too, and I think it's a difficult question to answer. I would say this, the further in time you get away, the older the data is. Really, though, the more if there are significant changes in the way that revenues are collected, if there are changes in state law about how revenues are collected, those would be the really big game changers. To be perfectly clear about it, these are estimates, and I think we have ascribed too much value to the dollar amount detail that's given in these reports. At the end of the day, if an area that you're considering is in a stronger than average of the unincorporated tax base, and it's not high in service demand or higher in service demand than the rest of it, it is almost certainly going to be viable for a reasonable service portfolio. If it's an area that's not, higher than the average of the unincorporated service area and it has high service demand, it's going to struggle because it's not going to have necessarily the revenues to provide a robust amount of services. So at the end of the day, I think without substantial changes to the circumstances, changes in revenues, changes in the services being provided, these studies are probably good for 6 or 7 years in terms of just being a general gut check on whether something's going to be fiscally feasible. At the same time, as an information tool, the older it gets, the more those changes crop up, the less valuable it'll be. I wish I could put a date on it, an expiration date, but I don't know how to do that.
No, thank you. That gives me great detail. Thank you.
23, is it Chairman Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. When looking at this list of cities, do you have a way that you look back and decide if they've been successful? Looking at the list, Sandy Springs, and that's been what, 20 years? It's been successful, I guess, from the looking at it from South Georgia, it looks fine to me, but how can you tell if it's really thriving and if it's done what it was supposed to do?
It's an interesting question, and we haven't been asked to do that. I think you'd have to decide what your measures of success were.
Right.
And there's different ways to do that potentially. Interestingly enough, the Athens-Clarke County Charter of the Unified Government, which unified in the early 90s, has an overview commission provision, and every 10 years the overview commission comes into being, and they've just come into being again, and they're charged with looking whether the unified government has met its purpose. And it's something of a vague charge, but they're going to spend the entire year looking and trying to answer that question. You do see other similar type charter review provisions in some local government legislation, and that might be one way of taking there are probably different ways to do that, some that might provide for public input, some that might provide for a commission to look into it, but that would be one way of doing it. But we haven't been asked to try to measure the success of one of the newer cities that's been created.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Jones, Representative Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Taylor, if you don't mind, I was the legislator who was the point person on Sharon Springs, and I will tell you, as we looked back at metrics, because we wanted to benchmark. We wanted to determine, was it right or was it wrong? One of the things that we kept talking about was, I think we could probably do it 3 years out, 5 years out with respect to Athens Clark. I think because leadership, meaning mayors and city councilmen, as they come in over the years, you just never know where the direction is going to go. So I think that benchmarking becomes more relevant, I'll say, in near-term years versus decades out. Again, respectfully to Athens Clark, I think going back to metrics that were formed back in the 1990s, we may want to revisit those type of metrics. So I don't know if they do revisit them, but I would say with Sandy Springs, we'd want to take a look at, or I'm not saying we should, but I would say we're 15 years out. We might want to take a look at what would the measurement of success be. But that's at least with my experience in Champion Springs.
It would help when we have to make a decision on some of these, looking at the size of some of the communities and where there's success and where there isn't. But again, it's up to the residents that live there, the citizens, it's their decision. But as we weigh these decisions, I want to see, what would be the best thing. Thank you for that.
Yeah, was it a train wreck?
Okay.
As a follow-up to Representative Shannon's question, I think that was a salient question because I think the best example of the matrix here is South Fulton. So basically 1 decade apart, they went from 15% support to nearly 4x support, almost to 60. Was a new viability or feasibility study done for South Fulton?
Before I forget, just in defense of Athens Clark County, it used to be a much shorter period of time, and they stretched it out to 10 years after the last time around. We did not perform at the Institute feasibility studies for South Fulton in either instance. I believe Georgia State did at one point, and I can't remember exactly when that was. But I don't know, so to your question, I don't know whether it was the first or second time or leading up to the second referendum. And obviously the circumstances changed drastically in Fulton County during that 9-year period.
Sure.
And so.
Okay, thank you. I didn't know if maybe that data, could I do one more question, Mr. Chairman?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. I know that you're aware that I was the legislator who dropped the bill on Sharon Springs, and you have an asterisk next to it because it went at 54% but was not created. 2 questions regarding, I'll say, the feasibility, and this is just something from our time with Sharon Springs. One is the question, is 3 enough? Meaning, is 3 services enough? And I know you guys try to keep a neutral position, but given your, I'll say, objective viewpoint, would you have an opinion for this committee around, is 3 services enough to be a viable city? And the second question is, the committee that was formed within Forsyth County, we decided to do a supermajority vote in order for a city to be created under, I'll say, the guise of, if you're going to do a major organ transplant, which that's what a city basically is, there is no going back, maybe 50% plus 1 just isn't enough. Maybe you need, again, a supermajority of those citizens saying, yes, we need an organ transplant. So do you have an opinion on, I'll say, the minimum the minimum services threshold, or the idea of whether or not this body should consider a supermajority as, I'll say, the path forward?
So I'll answer the first question first. Are 3 services enough? I mean, from our perspective, as trying to be a part of the process, I came to that conclusion just out of fairness. If the statute says you only have to have these 3, it seemed only fair to that be what I required of the groups who wanted the study. I think whether that's enough goes to the heart of the sincerity of what the people proposing the city really want to do with it. I think there is something to be said for the concepts of local control over planning, zoning, code enforcement, development, and those issues. If the group is sincere that that's really what they're after, then I would suggest that 3 services is probably enough. If it is a stalking horse for, if the group is using these 3 services as a stalking horse, if you will, so with real designs on providing in a short period of time significantly more expensive and complex services, I would say that is gaming the intent of having a feasibility study, and it's not fair to those involved in the process. As to your second question about a supermajority, I'll have to punt and say that's a decision for this fine body and others in the General Assembly.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. I just had one question about the feasibility study. These three institutions that are charged with doing these feasibility studies, have any of these institutions done a feasibility study on the same community just to kind of see what your findings are going to be? I mean, because if you've got these three different institutions that are doing these feasibility studies, I'm just curious, have you ever done one together to see what the outcome is going to be? If they're similar, if they're polarizing, I mean, that's just.
Well, I would say that, Georgia Tech has only been added here very recently. And I think so far, if I'm right, they've only done a county impact study.
Right.
Back in 2008, around the time of the incorporation of Dunwoody, our faculty worked with Georgia State faculty on coming up with some agreements about the methodology for how we do that.
Right.
Now, over time, the studies have been different. There have been different complex issues that have caused each group to look at them a little bit differently. GSU was doing work for DeKalb County, looking at impact at that time, and we were doing the feasibility study for Dunwoody. But because these groups pay for the study, and we rely on that contract funding to do our work, they've been reluctant. No group that I know has been willing to pay for two different institutions to do the study. So no, we have not both done a feasibility study on the same community.
Okay. I was just curious. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Nguyen.
With the feasibility studies, do you have a sense of how accurate they are of the actual incorporation in the aftermath?
Could you be a little more specific in terms
In terms of the numbers and the projections in the feasibility studies, do you have an overall sense of whether or not those were actually reflective of what happened once the city was incorporated?
Well, what we tell people is these are best estimates. Mm-hmm. We can't predict the future. We can't predict what decisions an as yet unelected city council will make. I think we've gone back at least once to look at revenue and expenditures and see how close we were on feasibility. Mm-hmm. Which I should another caveat is it's just a snapshot in a given time, right? It's just based on the most recent fiscal data. I think in Dunwoody, we managed to project their revenues within 1% margin of error, which was astonishingly close for us. Mm-hmm. There are probably other cities where if I went back and looked, we might not be that close. But I'd say it's a fair ballpark.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had this come up in the town hall where you gave us a presentation just a couple nights ago in DeKalb about whether or not there are services that after the initial 3 are used to get the city, if there's anything else that it's mandatory that the newly incorporated city take over down the road. I know you said that you did not believe that there were any other areas, or it seemed at the time you weren't aware of any other services that a city would have to take on in the future, which would affect taxes, affect feasibility, and all that stuff. But since that time, we've had some reps say that they have gotten opinions from legislative council that there are things that a city would have to take on down the road. Have you had a chance to research if anything has changed that would, I guess, are you still saying that cities can just provide whatever services they choose to provide indefinitely, and there's nothing else that they'd be forced to pay for down the road, whether they provide it or whether they contract with the county?
So there's a short answer and a real long answer. I'll give you the short answer first, which is I went back since our meeting 2 nights ago.
Thank you.
There were 2 statutes that were passed in 2015. One, which is located at 36-31-7.1, talks about county road rights of way. And the city is to take control of those unless both the city and the county agree by resolution otherwise. My challenge is there's no definition of county roads right of way. I'm not sure if that means the road itself and maintenance thereof, or rights of way, which is the curtilage on the sides where we put utilities and where the city is collecting franchise fees for use by electric utilities and others. There's also another statute language that was adopted in 2015, which is located at 36-31-8. It's in the transition period provision that allows for a transition period of up to 24 months in the act proposing the city. And subsection D there indicates that the county shall not remove roads within the new city without the agreement of the new city from the county road system. So in other words, I read that to say that within the first 2 years, they can't say, you know what, that's not our road anymore. I don't read that to require or to indicate that the city will have to take over a road 2 years, 3 years in. Because, and this is the longer answer, because service delivery is negotiated between cities and counties. And if they were to have to take over a service, then they would presumably get revenues that are otherwise being collected to provide that service by the government, the other government, the county. And you'd have to kind of relook at, that calculus of, we're going to take this over. What are the available revenues to provide the service within our jurisdiction? What's the service demand? How many road miles are we going to have to pave now? And I think you'd want to look at it, that issue then. But that's the only area, and I'm not sure that that's clear to me, that a city's necessarily going to have to take over the roads. If there's a legislative council interpretation, I would love to see it, and I might certainly change my view on it. But because service delivery is negotiated, I'm not aware of anything where it automatically becomes a duty of a city. I think all these things get negotiated. There are cities in Gwinnett County that provide very few services and haven't for decades. They focus on planning and zoning and a couple of other services. So,
Thank you.
I had one question, just maybe kind of wrap it up, since I don't think the question's been answered from the committee. It's been brought to my attention by a couple other members, just looking at the sheet that you gave us. We started out with, kind of a very strong consensus on some of these cities, and that's kind of evolved into a little bit more of a 50-50, or some may say that line goes actually straight down. So I just, not to put you on the spot, but have you noticed anything that would have maybe caused that, or anything that any reason for that trend?
Well, I think if you look at those cities that started out of the gate with those overwhelming majorities, the citizens for Sandy Springs advocated for cityhood for 30 years. And so there was overwhelming community consensus. I'd suggest that some of these cities were naturally identifying cohesive communities that saw themselves as sort of cities before they were cities. Tucker, which is on that list, was overwhelming. There were people who thought Tucker was a city before it was a city, because it was fairly understood what the boundaries were. Dunwoody was kind of the same way. As we've moved down the list, I think people are looking for, if you will, other local governance solutions, but I think they've struggled a little bit with identifying what's the community of interest that ought to be the boundaries of the city. And so I think that's what's made some of these latter ones closer questions.
Thank you. Chairman Fleming?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to comment on your question, and Ted said it succinctly. I'd say the low-hanging fruit got picked early. And now this concept of cityhood, which was very successful in some of those at the top of the list and has been, everybody else saw that and they said, well, man, that's great. Can we emulate that? Can we do that? And it's not as easy as it sounds. And Mr. Baggett summed it up when he said Sandy Springs tried for 30 years before they ever got theirs. Also, along what you said, Mr. Chairman, I'll tell the rest of the committee members, Ted Baggett is a great resource in the Carl Vinson Institute. Ted used to work over here at the Capitol last decade and is very familiar with our processes. And whenever I have a question about city issues and annexation and consolidation, Ted's who I call. So if you ever need a resource, the Carl Vinson is excellent, and Ted is right there with them and does a good job.
Thank you. Ms. Shannon, you had another question?
I do actually have a question for Representative Jones, and also the same thing for South Fulton, but just specifically because you brought Sharon Springs. What happened with Sharon Springs? The referendum shows that there was a majority to pass it, so why didn't it get created? Can you just tell us?
The short answer is I requested a year prior to the referendum, a 12-person committee be appointed by the 7 members of the state delegation and the 5 members of the Board of Commissioners. The reason for that was we were going to do our own, for lack of a better phrase, augmentation to what the Vincent Institute had done. During that year-long process, what became apparent to me and the committee, and this is my opinion, this is obviously, is that possibly allowing a change in government at a 50% plus one might not be the best way to go, and should we actually require a supermajority. So during the very end of the deliberations during that one full year, there was an analysis done of other states that looked at a supermajority, and there were 5 other states ranging from 55% to 66%. The committee, in the most unscientific fashion, at 12 members, went 6 at 55 and 6 at 60. So in the simplest way possible, there was consensus done at 57.5.
Thank you.
Representative Wynn, do you have another question?
Mr. Chair, yeah, just one more question. This is related to something Representative Shannon brought up early, but just the length and time in which a feasibility study exists. With the census coming up pretty soon, would it make sense, in your opinion, for feasibility studies to be updated based on the new numbers that will be available once we do a population recount?
I mean, as a general rule in any kind of research of this nature, the more recent your data, and the closer we are to a decennial census, the more accurate the decennial census numbers are. I hesitate to say, who needs to do another one, because these groups have to raise money and pay us, and I don't want to present data I think is no longer valuable as being valuable, nor do I want to make people pay for another study they don't really need. So it would be, fresher. I don't know that would drastically change anything.
Thank you. And also thank you for being with us for so long the other night in DeKalb. We appreciate it.
Just echo all the thanks, Mr. Baggett. I appreciate you being here. I want to thank the members of the committee for participating in all the great discussion this morning. I know this will continue. I see GMA over here to our left, and if there's any interest from any members in particular on this issue, the consideration is to have a smaller group kind of do a little bit further investigating, bring some recommendations, if any, maybe back to the committee. So if you're interested in serving in that capacity or would like to step up in that arena, please let me know. Thank you again. Does anybody have anything else for the good of the order this morning? Thank you again for being here. If nothing further, we stand adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks for the kind words.
Yes, sir.